we still have, believe it or not, more to cover. We're so grateful for all our panelists, but now we have an amazing panel assembled that we want to share with you. We've tried to focus for the first several hours on LGBT members, and now we want to focus on, the response from other just thoughtful people in the community who most of you will know and love in one way or another. We want to get sort of the straight perspective on this, the liberal and progressive perspective on this. We want to just hear thoughtful people, secular people, faithful people. We want to get everyone's reactions just so that we can really process this fully. And so we have assembled an amazing panel to discuss. And we have Greg Prince, who will be joining us later as well. I'm guessing that we're going to have to actually, at some point, stop this live feed and then restart it, because Facebook only allows us to go 4 hours. We started at 5:12, so we'll be able to go to 9:12. So that'll give us at least a good 30 minutes to have this panel on. And it looks like Greg won't be joining us. So let's see if we can do a good 30 minutes of discussion with the panel that we have. And if we need to extend it, we will. But today, we have several brilliant and thoughtful guests with us. All but one are former guests of Mormon Stories podcast. So I'll introduce the people who have been on Mormon Stories before. I'll try and do it by number of frequency of appearing on Mormon Stories. And then we'll have our one guest who's new, who we hope to be a future guest on Mormon Stories. So let's see, who's been on Mormon Stories the most? I'm going to say maybe Natasha Helfer Parker and Dan Witherspoon sort of tie. So let's have ladies first, if that's okay. Natasha, why don't you quickly introduce yourself? Welcome.
Hi, John. I'm Natasha Helfer Parker. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I'm a certified sex therapist. I'm the past president for the Mormon Mental Health Association, and I'll kind of be speaking my comments from that kind of lens.
All right. So glad you could join us, Natasha.
Thanks for having me.
Dan Witherspoon, introduce yourself to us really quick. You're the most recent Mormon Stories podcast episode, so it's fitting to have you back on.
Hey, thanks. And that was my final Mormon Matters as well. And just today I released the first episode of Latter-day Faith, my new project. What I didn't know, John, is that it takes about 3 days for iTunes to approve you to be, whatever it's called.
New podcast, yeah.
People to find it and all that. So it'll probably be about Tuesday for that, but I can send somebody a link if they want that. But anyway, I've just kind of known, I think, in this space as always trying to, hold the tensions and be as much as I can in a constructive kind of dialogue and whatnot, to feel the pain, feel the joy, and to see if I can always fill out, things in a way that's not quite as reactionary. So I guess that'll be what I'll say for right now.
So glad you're here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. All right. I don't know who's been on more between Roger Hendricks and Sam Young, but Sam, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience, the great Sam Young.
The great Sam Young. I don't know if I can introduce him. Anyway, Sam Young, I protect LDS children. We've expanded this year to protect every child. The goal of Protect LDS Children has been to do that very thing, is to change policies in the church to protect our children from the bad things that have happened to them as a result of worthiness interviews.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on, Sam, and you've been one of many champions in the past 5 to 10 years to really help instigate positive change in the church. So we're always honored to have you on Mormon Stories podcast.
Thanks, man.
Roger Hendricks probably holds the record for the longest individual interview in sort of one, I don't want to say one sitting, but across two sittings, 10 and a half hours. Former mission president, former CES director, former board member of the Deseret Trust Company. Roger, introduce yourself other than what I've already said. It's so great to have you back.
First of all, I'm still exhausted from the interviews we had. And, yeah, my name's Roger Hendricks. I was a former CES employee at the seminary, institute, and administrative levels. Left that to become a management consultant and a radio commentator. Let's see, I've had extensive church service, and is that enough, or do you want me to give a little more explanation, John?
No, that's great. It's so great to have you. And I'll just tell our listeners who didn't listen to Roger Hendricks' episode, you need to listen to it just like you need to listen to Sam's, Natasha's, and Dan's. We talk about how Roger was kind of vetted for the general authority, air authority kind of position. Roger always gets embarrassed when I mention that, but that's a great episode. You got to check it out. It's great to have you, Roger. Thanks for joining us. And our new member of the panel is somebody who I deeply admire, who is known across the progressive and post-Mormon world as being a great writer, a great thinker, a great human. He helps out with Sunstone. We have Anthony Miller in the house. Anthony, could you introduce yourselves to our audience?
Yes, my name is Anthony Miller, and I come to you from Billings, Montana. And about 3 years ago, our adult son came out to us as gay, and in an effort to find resources to support him, I stumbled across the Gospel Topics essays and other material that put me in a severe faith crisis. And over these last 3 years, people like you and Natasha and Dan and others helped me heal and grow. And today, I co-lead a local Mormon Spectrum support group, and I blog and try to help people through these kinds of things. So that's about me.
All right. Well, let's go around the horn and give everyone an opening chance to give their, initial, just sort of like what their reactions were or have been, and then we'll do some topical discussion. But let's start back with you, Natasha. Tell us about, whatever we've said a lot tonight already, and we don't want to necessarily totally recover the ground that we've covered. But what would you like to share about your reactions or reaction to the news today?
I think my reaction was fairly normal given the amount of pain that I've seen in the LDS community regarding this issue. I think my first initial kind of instinctual reaction was relief, like, oh, thank goodness, this is really a step that needed to happen. It should have been something that never really happened to begin with. And then, of course, the weight of it is then my secondary reaction, right? Because in the process of these last few years, we know that there's been a lot of irreparable damage, which is what so many of, I've been listening, to all of your previous panelists, and they've talked very well about the types of impacts that this has had in their very real lived experience within our Mormon, fold per se. So you can't just, celebrate and go forward without repair work. And that's kind of a basic mental health principle. And, my disappointment always in how the church goes forward with these steps of progress is that they kind of miss the boat in the repair perspective. And so that's, I guess, my initial response.
Beautiful. Thank you, Natasha. Dan.
Very similar, just both excited because love won, greater compassion was introduced into a very difficult space. we always want more in community. We want to learn from everybody. We want everyone to feel validated and understood and known. I interact with lots of folks, and I've certainly had my Twitter, or excuse me, my text messaging and Facebook Messenger, everything blow up, and I have to honor those who can't quite celebrate. And I wouldn't say celebration is my main word either. And I just, I have this hope, I have this ache in my heart that whatever we need to feel in terms of regret or sadness or the tragedy of, like Natasha said, something so unnecessarily small and so misguided, through, letting theory drive your experience and even what you think you receive from the Spirit. Dusty's situation there, that this last segment was that again, just like, this is what it must be because I was told this, what does it be? And it doesn't match with your heart. So I honor my friends that are not celebrating and who are in their sadness. I just hope that they won't stay there all the time. Get into constructive heart space as soon as we can.
Right. Thank you, Dan. All right, Sam. Initial reaction.
Well, the initial reaction was I didn't believe it. So I saw an article, I think it was the Deseret News, and I thought, oh, my friend Jonathan Streeter has done it again. He's recreated a fake news thing that everybody's believing. So I took a real close look at that and then saw the other news things and finally decided, okay, this is real. And there were several thoughts that ran through my mind. The first one was, hallelujah, great. They have done the right thing, finally, after all the pressure that has come upon them. I don't know what caused them to make the final decision. I don't know if they looked at what happened to Chick-fil-A. They're getting kicked out of airports, and they were going to see that governmental pressure come upon them, or if they saw the people leaving the church. All I know is this was the right decision. So I was very happy about that. But John, then this horrible feeling descended on me, a dark feeling, an angry feeling, because I reflected back on my experience over the last several years. I don't know if you remember when I started voting opposed. It was
of course.
Because of this very issue. That's what I was voting opposed about. And it affected my family. It affected my marriage. We talked about divorce. We had to work through a whole bunch of things just in my family because I was so passionate about this issue. And then reflecting on all the damage, suicides, divorces. This policy has done some serious damage to people. And so where I was happy on the one hand, well, I tell you, all the other emotions took over pretty heavy. I think I'm working through that, but I don't want to ignore. I kind of felt bad that I didn't make a bigger impact, that voting opposed really meant nothing to anybody. Anyway, but here's the other thing that I think is a really good thing. So we're calling for the church to make changes to a policy with regards to children, that we are the only church in the entire planet that does this to their kids. It's going to be changed. We want it to change sooner rather than later. And I'm looking at, here are the apostles. I'm just going to be plain and truthful, look like idiots for having put something forth 3 years ago and then completely reverse it. And they blame it both times on God. God told us to do this. Now God's telling us not to do this. But if they're willing to do that we have witnessed this thing, not 40 years after they put in some bad policy where everybody's forgotten about this. They were willing to do it within 3 years when everybody knows what's going on. You know what? I think they can have the courage to make the change with regards to the children, protecting children. So it's given me some renewed hope that they are actually going to do something to protect the children and have compassion on the damage that they've done with regards to those interviews. So there you go, John.
Yeah, that's a really important question. Is, and we can talk about this, if this can change this soon, and if we can see so many amazing changes just in the past year, what other changes might we be in store? But before we jump into that, Roger, what would you like? Let me unmute you. What would you like to say about your initial reactions?
Well, I got the news from you, and I have two thoughts. Number one, I've learned that when you're explaining, you're losing. And when you're explaining a lot, you're really losing. And the church leadership is now in the position where they have to continually explain their positions and shift. That just leads to more confusion. The more confusion you have, the more chaos you enter into, that enters into your organization. And then the second thought is, you don't have to believe anything that's not true. Am I still on?
Yeah.
And when I was the institute director at USC, I had a more than normal amount of PhDs going in sociology and in the law school. And at that time, the Black issue was the issue. And so when I would sit down there with them privately, I would just say, look at it, you don't have to believe anything that's not true. And they would always hesitate when I said that. I haven't ever backed down from that. In the church, there will continually be issue after issue after issue. You'll be happy if you just make up your own mind on what's right and what's wrong, and just stick with it. Like, I just forgot his name, Sam. You know, I saw him down there on those fasts. Here's a guy that just stuck with his position. I kind of like it. As a matter of fact, I really like it. You have Natasha there. She is the most irrepressible personality I think I've ever seen on these podcasts. And she just takes whatever position she thinks is right. She's happy. People are happier for that. And what you'll find is that eventually, issue for issue for issue, when you take a position, the church finally comes around to whatever the common sense conclusion will be. And I think that's my 2 points.
I love it. Dan's the little engine that could as well, by the way.
Sorry,
Dan. Dan's been at this longer than all of us.
I went through 3 hours with Dan the other night, so.
Yeah, you were there. Roger was there.
I'm for Dan.
Wait, Dan, Dan, you got to unmute yourself. What were you going to say, Dan?
Oh, I didn't know you were there, Roger. I would have loved to have met you. It's John's fault because everybody who kind of came after we started, and then we went when a bunch of people had to leave. So, anyway.
Superstars never recognize the little people.
Oh, brother. Thanks for saying that.
All right, thanks for that, Roger. Anthony, tell us your initial reactions.
Well, it was quite a spectrum of reaction. I mean, personally, it was a confirmation, at least of my reconciliation, that there are problems with the idea of mantles of discernment, because the narrative was that all 15 prayed and confirmed that this was God's will a little over 3 years ago. And that's what that loss of belief that there are such things as mantles of discernment is what initiated my faith crisis, reading the Race and the Priesthood essay. And the policy was another one of that. And this policy being rescinded, just whether it's confirmation bias or not, my perception is that it's additional evidence that that we're all fallible human beings, and there are problems with this premise of Jesus at the head with mantles of discernment. The next thing that I was concerned about was, because I'm supporting people in a faith support group, faith crisis, faith transition, and so forth, is my concern was that I see these kind of binary black and white things happening among true believing or active believing Mormons, as well as among post-Mormons. And so my concern was that the post-Mormons are going to alienate the active believing Mormons by spiking the football and saying, see, I told you so. And then the active believing Mormons on the other side, the true believing Mormons that are binary thinking, are going to use this as an example that God was testing us, and this was a litmus test of your faithfulness and loyalty to follow the prophet, even when they got something wrong. And I think both of those things are counterproductive. And so where I've kind of settled on is what my hope is, that what has happened here is, number one, that active believing or true believing Mormons, that this experience could maybe increase a sense of empathy for those of us who have lost belief in discernment and in the church, that maybe they don't reconcile it the same, but at least they could have empathy for their family members who have experienced a loss of faith, number one. And number two, from the post-Mormon side, my hope would be that this would be a call to work with believing Mormons and to focus on listening to stories like Dusty's, and to focus on doing the things that need to be done to do the best that we can to minister to those who were traumatized by this policy, some irreparably, as has been mentioned, and do the things that are attributed to the teachings of Jesus Christ, to mourn with people, to sit with them, to clothe them, to visit them, to feed them, and so forth. And so I experienced a full spectrum of emotion. The real tender part is, my fear is all this excitement, or the way that some people are treating this, like, oh, we changed it, now it's no big deal, you can come back to church now, or we're all super over celebratory in terms of our excitement about it, is that we're minimizing the trauma and the experience of the people that were really, really harmed by this policy. So that's the spectrum of what I initially felt.
Thank you. Very, very thoughtful, Anthony, and all of you. Yeah, I had to check myself. Honestly, I don't know what people would expect, or if they would even think about what my reaction would be, but my initial reaction was just celebratory. It was just like, amazing, less suicides. We can't have it both ways as post-Mormons. Hate it when the church makes bad decisions, and then when they fix the decisions or make things better, hate that too. So it made me feel like we, to be logically consistent, we just have to say this is awesome and celebrate it. And then I got checked by people who were like, this is a gut punch because of all the pain and suffering that we went through as a result of the policy. So I had to immediately mute my reactions. Let me just ask a bunch of general questions, and I'm going to ask it just to the general audience, and I want you guys just to jump in as you have thoughts. Number one is the timing. I don't think anybody predicted that it would happen this soon. Dan, I remember last year I made some comment somewhere, and I think I remember you saying to me, John, your comment's going to affect the brethren because they're deliberating making change, and your comment's going to ruin that. So I think, Dan, at least you had it in your mind that changes were potentially in the works, and maybe others did too. Who wants to talk about the timing and maybe the motive around this change, although we're all going to be speculating. Dan, do you want to start?
Well, I'm sure they didn't want to do it during conference because it would dominate. So I think they're hoping for the news cycle to die down a little bit by then. It'll be interesting to see who brings it up, if it's even addressed at all. It could have been everybody had written their talks already, and this is the only time they could squeeze it in. But somehow or other, they felt like this needed to be done now. I don't know if partly is the timing of Jana Reese's book. I know they do their own data or whatnot, but that certainly has to have gotten to them. And I guess when I say things like what you said, I said.
And that's basically saying Jana Reese's book, which is the New Mormons, right?
And millennials and all the generational views and the changing and whatnot. And they certainly know they're bleeding, members and whatnot. But
that the church is bleeding millennials largely because of the LGBT policies, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a major factor, it sounds like, to me,
Yeah.
from what she says. But my optimism always stems from just the arc of the church. We do really bad things, and we're really closed off. And again, we think we know, therefore it doesn't even let us ask. So when Dallin Oaks was, to me, in the early days of ordained women, we already know the answer to that. We're not even going to go. We're not even going to go to the Lord on this. And so I think that's what we've seen, enough of a groundswell from members and from, I think, within the quorums themselves. I don't think this was a unilateral thing. I don't think, like Anthony was saying, that they all got together and prayed. We know that certain ones were gone. All those kinds of different things. I don't know that I believe that narrative. So I've read, Ed Kimball's book about his dad's presidency. I've read Greg Prince's book about the McKay presidency. Clearly, all those things in the different dynamics are going on behind the scenes then. So I always just say, why aren't they going? Yeah, of course they're going on now. So that would be my initial thought on that.
And to others, like this idea that they, obviously the belief and the teaching is that they're prophets, seers, and revelators, that God and Jesus are at the helm, and that they're directing the decisions. And given how long it took to make changes around, people of color, blacks in the priesthood, polygamy, etc., the timing for me was just 3.5 years is a really fast change to like completely make a 180-degree turn. And
to me, that only speaks to the discord within the quorum. One of the things that really hit me hard today was exactly what we saw in the July after President Nelson had called it a revelation with the seminary manual, where we saw 4 different versions of it. One that was everything's a revelation, even policies, and it's either an eternal policy or an eternal doctrine or a temporary policy, and you had to vote, or the idea was that the seminary teachers would do it. And then there was pushback on that, so there was this very tame version. Then there was a version where Elder President Nelson's remarks about LGBT in Hawaii at that long thing were in there, and then finally it went away again. So clearly within the quorum itself and within the debates, this whole comfort level with calling it a revelation to begin with, that wasn't sitting. And you just sort of see how they rolled it out and how they were stumbling to roll it out. And then they had to emergency, get Todd Christofferson to do with Michael Otteson. None of this went the normal way. But the one thing I want to quickly say that I don't think a lot of people know, Section 107 of the DNC deals right with this. It talks about the unified quorum. When everybody gets together and makes a decision, you can consider it revelation. But it goes on. It's like these are in the verses, the late teens into the 20s and 30s. It says, but sometimes a decision gets made and it doesn't involve the whole, the consensus. In other words, it might have to be made even when they don't have consensus. But it says something to the tune of, this is not to receive the same status of revelation as the other ones. And so I think that's what we clearly saw here. And so that's why I think they can turn it around quicker. Because
John, I have
Yeah, Roger, please. I think I'll just give you a setup. I think you maybe have had more access to knowing that you were called to the Deseret Trust Company by Gordon B. Hinckley himself knowing that you sat on the board of a multi-billion-dollar church-run organization. I think of all of us on the panel, you've had the most direct access to the players and to the decision-making process. So I would love to hear your perspective here on the timing and on the inner mechanics of how these decisions do and don't get made.
Yeah. Okay. No two individuals agree on every issue all the time, and especially is that the case with the Quorum of the 12. They've got to be independent of thought, and when there's not a buy-in, you see what happens. Number two, I'm going to take a more secular view. We're living in a time of great populism worldwide, where all institutions are being taken apart. We see it in our own government right now, and we see it in the church right now. This is not going to go away, and why is that? The internet provides the community, and the community is fast, and the community exchanges a lot of opinion and a lot of wisdom, and the community, and you try and stay ahead of the internet community, and if you don't, you start getting things like Mormon Stories podcasts and Mormon Matters and all of these things, and people start talking. You don't think they talk, but they talk, and then they communicate real fast. And worldwide, we're tearing down all the institutions we thought were perfect. And what we're finding out is ain't nothing perfect anymore. And so we're going to put the church back together. We're going to put the government back together. And so, fasten your seatbelts, enjoy it. And if there's any child within earshot where anti-homosexual attitudes are expressed, just speak up. Don't let anybody have a short leash on, a long leash on this. Cut them at the pass, and nothing will happen to you, and you'll be right. That's what I think.
First of all, I'd like to say something. First of all, I'd like to thank Roger for some of the best compliments I've gotten in a while. So thank you.
Let's not forget Mormon Mental Health Podcast as we list groundbreaking podcasts, right?
I was just about to say that.
Thank you. So just taking it from kind of, again, a mental health perspective, and I don't know, this is all speculation, but I would hope that the focus on suicide rates in Utah, one of our own apostles, Rasband, was, put on the task force to address teen suicide. This has been an issue that's being addressed across the nations. It's something that people are really concerned about. And we've gotten a lot of research recently in the last probably 5 years in particular that really shows this correlation between exclusion and communities and families who exclude in one way or another LGBTQ plus folks, that the risk of suicide then is like tremendous. Like for transgender folks, it's 8 times plus the amount of the national suicide rate. And for LGBT folks, it's about 3 to 5 times higher. So I can't imagine that they would be completely immune to those messages getting through, and that the, pretty, I would say, intense feedback that they've received from many of us has been that, hey, this is really harmful. The Mormon Mental Health Association at the time of the policy release made a very significant position statement. And even, I don't know how many of you are aware that the Human Rights Association made a statement today. So, and this was on CNN News. So this is not something that is being ignored or, that's just happening in this insular place. Kind of like Roger is saying, like we are now as a community, as a larger community, holding each other accountable at a whole nother level. So I don't know how it's sustainable really for the church to continue to hold bigoted practices and beliefs much further. We're seeing, the progress of social justice is incredibly increasing at a much rapid rate. The rates of the United States population being accepting towards LGBTQ plus folks has, multiplied significantly just in like 10 years alone. So this idea that, in the past, we would see social justice issues in the church maybe lag by 30 years, I no longer think is tenable if the church is going to survive. I think we're going to see that lag be more like 5 years. So that's my projection and my reasoning around some of the timing.
I love it. Thank you, Natasha. We love the mental health perspective. We are here 4 hours into our discussion of the LDS Church's announcement today that it is rolling back, undoing the LDS November 2015 LGBT policy. We're in the middle of this conversation. I'll ask everyone joining us right now to please share this part 2 feed on their Facebook walls, because we want to make sure everybody gets a chance to join us, and we hope that the audience climbs back. I won't spend a lot of time trying to recap. Let's just jump right into it. So Natasha, Roger, and Dan, I really appreciate your responses. I do want to push back a little bit. Okay, for some reason I'm seeing someone's desktop.
Looks like Dan's.
Oh crap! Sorry. All right. I was trying to share it on my wall. Sorry.
That's okay. So stop sharing, Dan.
Yeah, I'll quit.
Wrong share icon.
Yeah, probably. You guys' fine faces were in my way.
Okay, so I think.
Stop share. Oh, sorry. I didn't quite do that.
Okay. So so we've heard Dan and Roger and Natasha respond. I'm going to push back a little bit.
I was trying to share it on my wall. Sorry.
That's okay. So stop sharing, Dan.
Yeah,
okay, we're getting feedback now.
Wrong share icon.
Yeah, probably. You guys' fine faces were.
Somebody's. Okay, so I think stream is playing, and so we're hearing,
so mute your computer.
Everybody mute.
So there we go.
Okay, so sorry everyone for that technical glitch. Welcome back to our ongoing discussion about the overturn of the November 2015 policy that happened today, April 4th, 2019. We've heard some amazing commentary so far. Let's jump right back into it. Thanks to everyone who's been able to rejoin us. We're up to 165. I hope we can get back at 280 or 90. I hope everyone will share this stream on their walls so we can get our audience back up and join us. The question I have and the pushback is, I'm still surprised. Yes, there's been suicides. Yes, that's serious. Yes, there's the internet, Roger. Dan, yes, there wasn't unanimity in the quorum, but 3.5 years is a really, and yes, Dan, there's been millennial disaffections in Jenna Reese's book, but I'm just going to say for me, 3.5 years to do an about face, I'll say it this way. What I've felt for some time, and this may be viewed as cynical. I don't mean it as cynical, but I think people can view it as cynical. For a long time now, many of us have felt like the way the brethren seem to be operating the church, sometimes what appears like is that what's most sacred or most urgent is public perception, but even more sacred and urgent and expedient and important is prophetic authority, because as the church has to recede on matters of doctrine, as they have to assimilate into the culture, as they back off more and more important issues, in response to all the social movements, they backtrack on polygamy, they backtrack on blacks in the priesthood, they backtrack on women in many ways. They're backtracking on the church's history. What seemed like to be the line that they couldn't cross was backtracking on the perception of prophetic authority and of God leading and directing this church. It seems like that is the thing that they cannot backtrack on, because if it's one thing to make some changes around social justice issues, or to agree that our history is messy, or even to agree that the brethren make mistakes, but to have something that was declared as doctrine in only 3.5 years be rescinded and an about faces made, what they risk when they make a change like that is for Orthodox members to say, I think you guys are just making this up. I think you guys are just caving to social pressure. And that just seemed like 3.5 years would not be enough time. And to add to that, I would have expected that this would not have happened while Dallin H. Oaks and Russell M. Nelson were still alive, that those two gentlemen would never have allowed this change to happen in their lifetimes, because I think there's a general understanding that they were behind these changes, that Thomas S. Monson was suffering from dementia, that they were the most senior leaders who probably behind the scenes made the change. So not only would they not want the change because they felt so passionately about it, but because they were sort of the main two guys who made it. So there's no way in their lifetime that this would have happened, in addition to the fact that it immediately calls into question who's at the helm. Is this God? Is this Jesus? So who, let's have Anthony or Sam jump in, and then others.
I do have some thoughts
about
that.
Anthony.
Yeah, I definitely do have some thoughts about that. I think I would say that it's the heart that makes the difference. I mean, Dan could probably confirm this, but the Thoughtful Faith Waters of Mormon support group was instrumental to me at the beginning of my faith transition. And I remember one of the moderators there telling me that at any given time, about 1/3 of the new applicants for that group, that loving an LGBTQ person was what led to them developing nuance or unpacking their shelves or experiencing a faith crisis. And in our local Mormon Spectrum support group, sometimes we talk about what might lead people to accept nuance or unpack their shelves. And I think we pretty much all agree that an opportunity to love and mourn with and spiritually connect with and love an LGBTQ person changes you. It changes your heart. And so my opinion is that it's a variety of things. I think that the brethren heard the stories like Stockton's story, and probably heard the mourning and the loss of the parents. And they paid attention to what Richard Ostler is doing. And they paid attention to the reaction to Dan Reynolds and Love Loud. And I hope that some of them sat in a funeral somewhere of an LGBTQ youth that committed suicide and felt and experienced that. I remember when I was going through my faith crisis and having a gay son and not having been exposed to transgender people, I didn't really know or understand it. And I went to Sunstone, and while I was at Sunstone, Kimberly Anderson sat down with me and listened to my story, validated my experience, and expressed unconditional love to me and gave me a hug. And it totally changed my experience and perception of transgender people from that experience. And so my opinion or observation or speculation is that their hearts were touched, that they had opportunities to love people, to mourn with them, to see and experience their pain. And they actually mention the pain and the trauma that, they don't use the word trauma, they mention the pain that the policy inflicted. I think that this is also part of why we had the rewording in the endowment and the initiatory and the sealing with regard to women to make it less sexist, is I think that they were able to listen to and mourn with women that experienced trauma or pain because of what was there. And so that's my hope, is that they're opening their hearts, that they're listening, that they're not only in an echo chamber, and that that's what's leading to these kinds of change.
Love it. Sam, do you want to add something?
As to why they made the change?
And how they could, how Oakes and Nelson could have let it happen, and how they could have let it happen so soon, knowing the risks of people calling their prophetic inspiration and authority into question.
Well, it would only be speculation, but I think there's been so much pressure inside and outside that they finally had to make some changes. But I really like what Anthony had to say about them being touched by stories. Well, by golly, that gives me more hope. We've got all kinds of stories that we provided to them. So Anthony, I hope you're exactly right. That's why they made the change.
I think that if you look at the leadership of the church under a different paradigm, not so much as prophets, seers, and revelators, but as people who are commissioned to keep the flock sound and to grow the church. The data is in fact showing that the church is no longer growing. That concerns them. And then if the flock is straying, their ears perk up. And so these guys get together and they say, we're not growing, and the flock is really chaotic. And you know something? When we can't get 50,000 people at the Rice-Eccles Stadium, but Dan Reynolds can. This thing is slipping away. And then what they do is they take a hard look. I don't think their thinking is profound. I think they're like hundreds and thousands of CEOs I've been around. And you're going to get fired if it's not holding together. And so kind of take that prophet, seer, and revelator out and then look at this. That's why take a look at what they have to do as leaders. And then you really have to take a position and hold with it. And if it's good common sense, it'll just win out.
I love it. Anybody else want to address this topic before I ask another question to the group? We're good?
Well, I would just say, like with Dusty, he had to have an experience with God for it to overwhelm his view that he's somehow defective or that he wasn't loved or something. And so experience has to lead out. And so I'm hoping with Anthony and with Sam that it is this accumulation of direct experiences that is finally getting them to say, oh, maybe my theory isn't as solid as I thought. Maybe the plan of salvation isn't as clear as I, thought in all the details. So it has to be led by experience. Otherwise, you have no incentive to change your thinking.
I love it. So is there anybody who, Kimberly brought up an interesting point earlier. I just assumed it was an unambiguous good that this change happened purely because it would obviously result in a reduction of youth and adult LGBT suicides. Natasha, you've probably dug into that issue a lot. Maybe others can too. Kimberly Anderson made the point that it's not necessarily that unambiguous, that while there will be LGBT youth that are encouraged by this change, who will be happy to know that if they get same-sex married, that they may not automatically be guilty of apostasy, and that their children will still be able to be members, and that will potentially reduce despair for some or many. Kimberly said that could be offset by the crisis of faith that this change may instigate in some of our LGBT youth and brothers and sisters, and that in and of itself could be potentially not good for their mental health and lead to depression or anxiety. Does anybody want to speak to that question of whether this will inevitably, unambiguously lead to less suicide and improved mental health for our LGBT youth and adults?
So,
Well, go. Who?
is that okay?
Go ahead.
So one of the members of our support group had a comment that I thought was helpful, and the comment was actually manifest in your interview with Dusty, and that is that Dusty's stake president would have excommunicated him anyway for living with his partner. It just wouldn't have been for apostasy. And so while this is progress and it's a sign that hearts are changing, it's still an untenable position, because it's still communicating to those youth that if you're Dusty and you have a stake president like he does, you're going to get excommunicated. And there's not a place for you in the plan of salvation or in the church, and you're not going to partake of the sacrament or have a calling, and so forth. And so there's much, much more that needs to happen for there, in my opinion, which is not professional in any way, for these things to really make a significant difference for our youth.
Yeah, and I had written earlier that this is a wonderful progress from a space that's fairly horrific to begin with. And so what that implies is that these are very minute changes in the lived experience of LGBTQ plus youth and adults in our church, because at this point, there is still no reconciliation with their faith. There's no reconciliation with a normative lifestyle of romance, of sexuality, of being able to live kind of a family-centered lifestyle with people of their choosing and that they're naturally attracted to and want to have relationships with. I really appreciated so many of the people that came on the panel earlier that were in mixed orientation marriages. We need to take responsibility as a community that we create those dilemmas for people. And these dilemmas are very well researched that they do cause mental health harm. One thing that I thought was interesting, I thought I would just read the Human Rights campaign.
Human Rights Commission.
Yeah, it's a very short statement. And I want to point out, I think, what the difference is between an outside kind of position that wants to dance that balance between being supportive of something that they already know is very harmful, so the Human Rights Campaign is probably no fan of the Mormon Church. And yet this was their statement today. They say, in this reversal, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has taken an important step forward. There's still work to do, but this policy reversal is a very welcome change that moves the church closer to a day where LGBTQ Mormons can see themselves affirmed and included within their faith community. Now, they're saying in two sentences, they're giving us props and very respectfully saying that we are still not affirming or including our people, our LGBTQ people, in our faith community. Now, it is up, an outside organization is only going to be able to say so much, because as soon as you're an outsider, well, we know how we feel about outsiders, right? We don't tend to listen to outsiders. We don't trust outsiders. Outsiders don't get us, etc. So I really, if I get anything across tonight, it is really the job of us, the allies, not the LGBTQ folks, right? Because they're in the ditches, right? They're in the trenches. They're bleeding out. It is our job to really be the much stronger advocates, so that in a space of faith community and of using the language that we share as a Mormon people, to call this behavior out, to call the trauma out, and to call the church unto repentance as the church calls us unto repentance. Because in essence, the church is us, we are the people. So those are my initial thoughts of, I think that we still have, we can talk about this as progress, and yes, it's a huge change, and yes, bureaucratically, it's amazing that this happened in 3.5 years. Yes. And the whole thing stinks to begin with, and it's awful, and people are dying because of it, and people are having ruined decades of their lives. And it's a timeline issue. It's like a timeline issue. So if you're born 50 years from now, you probably won't have to deal with the same issues that Mormons have to deal with today. And it's not fair. And it's not, and it's, especially if you're in a place of privilege, which means that you're straight, you're cisgender, which means that you relate to the gender that you were born with and identify with it. It's time to be quiet. It's time to listen. And it's time to advocate in ways that you have power to advocate, whether that's in your board councils, in your bishoprics, in your Relief Society presidencies, with your youth. That's the job that now allies have.
I love it. Others want to pine on this question before I ask another?
Please ask another question.
Okay. What do you guys think of Oakes's statement that this is revelation, and basically mentioning Monson as being the leader of the past decision, claiming that the past decision was revelation, but also saying that this is revelation? Is that gaslighting? Is that disingenuous? Is that sincere? Is that, harmful? Or do we be mad about that? Do we just sort of have empathy and love for that? Any responses? Does that make anyone mad? Anyone have thoughts about that?
I think it was a total sneaky move.
Why,
Sorry.
Natasha? And then Roger after Natasha. Why?
Well, I do. I mean, although I do like to give our leaders the benefit of the doubt, at the same time, there is a pattern of, kind of, we'll do this to kind of get this result. And I think that's what Kimberly Anderson was talking about, back when we were doing the whole movement. And, Oakes is a lawyer and who has been very, very, immersed in this kind of world of making sure that we have religious freedom to discriminate against LGBTQ people. I mean, that's just a reality of our current leadership. And so when they were going through this whole thing a few years ago of being so inclusive to LGBTQ people, especially in the in the state of Utah, especially when it came to living arrangements and things like that. But in that came also all of this other language of making sure that private organizations still had the right to discriminate. So by no means does that count BYU. BYU housing isn't going to be included in that type of inclusionary way. So they kind of come across as oh yeah, we want to help in this regard, but only on our terms. So they have a history of that. And so you can't act that way, not repent, and expect us to just give you the benefit of the doubt all the time.
Thanks, Natasha. Roger, what were you going to say?
I think that, Natasha has said it very eloquently and succinctly. I have a practical comment to make, and that is, I think things are closing in, and you could take different data points. For example, if the enrollment at BYU is starting to shrink, if it's at BYU Hawaii, it's starting to shrink. If the Fed is coming down on you on the law you have to uphold, or all, they can do many things. They can revoke your tax exempt status. And so I think there are just too many markers, from enrollment to closing down of institutes to this meeting tonight. And I think people like Dallin Oakes, you don't have to kind of ferret your way through all the nuances of his language. He will move in accordance with what's best for the flock, to keep the flock intact and to keep the church growing. And if those things come apart, he could care less about whether he is saying policy or revelation or doctrine. They're just going to they're going to solve problems. And let me tell you, there's a lot of problems that are going to get solved over the next decade, like this. And okay, I don't want to take up too much here. We are in a period of social justice. Individual human rights are important. And what you're going to find is we can all improve, and the church really has to improve from, you know, like little kids being interviewed for masturbation blew my mind. You just can't do that. And parents let it happen. They're not going to let it happen anymore. Church leaders won't let it happen anymore. The string is unraveling. They've got to keep that thing wound. That's it.
Thanks, Roger. Sam, I hear you. I see you nodding.
So you ask about the language. I really don't like the way they talk. To me, it's the emperor's clothes, the emperor's naked, and all the. I remember listening to Elder Oaks explain at a BYU talk about the Hoffman forgeries, that the church was fooled. They didn't say they were fooled. He kind of blamed the members. It was laid. His language was one that they didn't have any fault, but the members needed to learn something from this. And I'm just looking at, look, I don't care about any of that stuff. You're going to have your reasons, and you're going to try to explain it in ways that the members can walk away and say, okay, that makes a lot of sense, but it makes no sense to me. But I really don't care about that. I care about making a policy that is going to do good things. So I don't like the way they say it, but they made a policy change that is a good policy change. And I'll feel the same way when they eliminate these idiotic masturbation interviews. When they do that and they say they received something, well, fine, say whatever you want to do, but good for you, you protected the children. So I don't like the language, but that's not my focus.
Yeah.
Dan, did you want to weigh in on this question? Or
just quickly, tie it back to your earlier question about how could it happen within 3.5 years? And I look at the language in there. We're not changing our doctrine, and it's still a serious transgression. And, you know, Oaks and Nelson, who you said it's a shock that while they're alive and they're in the, you know, the top 2 positions of the 15, that it would ever change. I think you might be right that those kinds of language, you know, the plan of salvation as we understand it is perfect. This is not a change in doctrine. This is, you know, it's still a serious transgression. It's, you know, not ideal or whatever it was. Those might not change, but, you know, that's what that rhetoric at least communicates.
Got it. Anybody want to respond on the lack of an apology and just the longstanding quote from Elder Oaks that we don't request nor offer apologies? Anybody want to take that one on, or is that not worthy of discussion?
Oh, I'll take it on. You know, again, from a mental health perspective, I think of this whole situation from the lens of trauma, because that's what we have inflicted upon our LGBTQ members. And so when you think about kind of the best standards of care in regards to trauma treatment and some of the things that can be beneficial to the healing of trauma, it actually follows fairly closely to our repentance model. You know, it's a fairly close fit, with the first thing that's needing to happen is protection from the abuse, right? Protection from the abuse. That's very difficult in our church because I believe that our current doctrinal understanding is abusive. So our current way of understanding and implicating our doctrine on people is abusive. So right from the first point, we already have a problem. Secondly is apologies have to be made. Okay, so we know that apologies are not magic wands that take away all the pain and that magically make everything better. And I think your previous panelists talked about this. At the same time, it is a piece of the puzzle that helps with healing, because it at least acknowledges responsibility, accountability, it validates people's pain, and those things that are irreparably damaged can at least heal in a space of more, the soil is more fertile for healing when you have apologies that are matched with those things. Then comes, of course, kind of acceptance of the things that can't change. And then comes the ongoing repair, right? Ongoing repair and resources. And so that's why, when I say that this is a wonderful progress from a space that is so horrific to begin with, like this whole day doesn't even start on step one, right? That's what I want to be very clear about. And what we have to continue to hold our church accountable for, because we are amidst our brothers and sisters. We have covenanted to weep with them, to mourn with them, to lift each other's burdens. And we are not currently doing that for our own people. So I think apologies are very important. I think it's extremely narcissistic, undoctrinal, and unchristlike for one of our own apostles to say what he said about apologies. I think that's apostasy in my mind, and he should be held accountable for that. That's what I have to say about apologies.
So I would bring up a couple thoughts. First is, if I'm being charitable, I think that a lot of them are in the faith force field bubble type of thing, where they perceive spiritual experiences as divine witnesses of truth that justify the decisions that they've made. And I'm not totally skeptical like some post-Mormons are, that think that they are totally ingenuous in their belief that what they're doing is divinely related. But I'd also suggest that what Roger brought up, this concern about institutional protection and growing the flock and so forth, and positively affecting people that they believe that they have a stewardship to do, I think is important. And if we remember back to that PowerPoint slide with the circles, that you didn't get as big of a circle as some other people kind of thing. Remember that one? That the church leaders seem to be more concerned about losing conservative members than progressive members. And I speculate that one of the reasons why not to do apologies is the concern is that they're going to lose conservative members to Denver Snuffer type movements, to polygamous group type movements and so forth. And instead of doing the right thing, which I believe that they would know is the right thing to do in their heart, is to apologize, they're still prioritizing the institutional protection of trying to prevent people from believing that they're in apostasy by apologizing and admitting mistakes. That's my sense.
Love it. Thank you, Anthony.
So can I weigh in on that just a little bit?
Please.
Yeah, well, they need to apologize. It's shameful that they would have the attitude that when the church hurts somebody, that they will not apologize. But that what it may, we can do something with regards to this. Last summer, during that hunger strike, we had a meeting where we had, I think, about 300 people attend, and we offered an apology. 39 bishops put their names on an apology to adults who were harmed as children during these interviews. Now, I did that because I felt like they were owed an apology, but I didn't know what I was doing. And frankly, John, I get a whole ton of things wrong, but every once in a while I get something right. And a sociologist contacted me after that and said, Sam, have you ever heard of vicarious? Oh, geez, I can't remember what he said. Vicarious apology, but he used a different word. He said that is an important principle that is being used in various places for serious crimes, like somebody that commits a murder, somebody that commits a rape. Well, you don't want to talk to the murderer or the rapist, but the family that was involved. But to receive an apology for somebody that was a rapist or somebody that did commit a murder, he said they're doing that now, and it means an awful lot to people. I'd never heard of that. What I know is after we made that apology, I had a ton of people come up and say, thank you. That was one of the most spiritual things or touching things they've ever experienced. Being apologized by bishops, even though they weren't the bishops that caused the trauma in their childhood, but they were still bishops. It meant a lot to them. So I'm just going to take this opportunity. If there's anybody here that's been traumatized over the last 3.5 years by this crappy, horrendous policy that was not instituted by God, if you are harmed by that, I, as a bishop or a former bishop, as a person, as a human being, this was my church over most of that 3.5 years. I apologize that it happened to you. It never should have happened. These suicides shouldn't have happened. The divorces shouldn't have happened. The people leaving the church because this was the last straw. Let me just say, I'm sorry that ever happened to you or your family, the disastrous effects that this policy had.
Thank you, Sam.
John, I want to just take a little different angle here for a moment, because what has been said is wonderful, profound, and Natasha, she's just been hitting the ball out of the ballpark here. Let's try and understand how the church leadership really works. Let's now go back to prophets, seers, and revelators, the first presidency and the quorum of the 12. Now, their understanding, and those who have been initiated in the church, they understand that nothing matters except what they say at the present time. And so what Joseph Smith said, or what you can bring up about what Joseph Smith said, doesn't matter unless those 15 men buy into it. And so they can have a policy 3.5 years ago or 3.5 days ago, and then change it, and they will say, it doesn't matter what was said then, however short or long it may have been. The only thing that matters is what we say right now, and nothing else matters. The scriptures don't matter. Don't bring up the scriptures to us. We are prophets, seers, and revelators, and all you have to understand is what we say right now. Now, I am almost positive that's what they're thinking. That's how they operate. And as one who has been familiar with them at a close distance, I know that's how that is operated. And then other than that, they all have their opinions, and they discuss and they discuss very forcefully, very frankly, and then, but right now, if they were to say it differently, that's what matters. And when you have a robust president of the church, what he says right now, the other guys better fall in line. And what really happened was President Nelson just said, this isn't working. I don't care what I said 3.5 years ago. This isn't working right now. We must change. And they changed, and they changed quickly. And they'll continue to change. That's my 2 cents.
Love it.
Man, all you guys are so freaking powerful. The only one thing I guess that's missing is, individuals need to do shadow work, and to get.
What do you mean by that? Tell us what that means. I read that in Richard Rohr recently, following up.
Yeah, good for you, reading Richard Rohr.
Yeah.
Well, shadow is just the wounds, the deep scars, the evidence of all the pain and whatnot that we carry with us because we haven't felt like we had the strength or the courage, or we weren't in a safe enough environment, or feeling enough love to actually hold up and look at and examine and have the chance for light and air to do the healing. And so things that are wounding us, we can consider our shadow, because we'll form a story that basically, ignores it. So no light gets shined on it, so it's in a shadow. Well, institutions, have shadows, and we're still under the shadow of polygamy. We're still under the shadow of racial, relationships and teachings. We're under so many shadows, and we need to deal with it. But we're never going to be able to do that unless we admit this story that we've told about ourselves as a church, and this story we've told about Revelation as being, basically, we certainly have let it, for most people, think it's a phone line to God. They have to change that in order to now be vulnerable enough to even start to think about institutional apology and institutional, healing and whatnot. Right now, the best you ever get is mistakes were made. It's always in that passive voice. It'll never be, we did this and we were wrong. But it's progress. We see how long it's taken the Catholic Church to do a lot of these things. Other smaller churches seem to be able to do that sort of stuff and get in touch with this deep community pain and embarrassment and things that we want to hide away. And the church just needs to get there. And I would say if there was, let's say, the top 5 themes that were in Mormon Matters for those 500 plus episodes, I think I probably would put Revelation and the nature of Revelation and the human component and the divine component and the weird alchemy between the two. And especially when you combine it with the idea that the Holy Ghost is a confirmer above all else, confirming what we already know is true, you get yourself into just a big mess. And all I want is some vulnerability from a general authority. And one could get it started, and then another would do it and say, I wrestle with this. I don't know what's going up. I'm in the wrestle here. It's not clear. I'm working my guts out, and this is what's going on with all of us here. Once you start there, then you can at least begin to work on those things. So sorry to go so long.
Love it, Dan. And one of our listeners, Sherry, writes, "I've never heard of shadow work. Wow, just blew my mind." So
I would say that there's an NPR podcast, Next Door Strangers, and episode 4, number 4, is an interview with Maxine Hanks on this topic.
Oh, good.
Recently or from a while back?
Well, it got posted to our group, so I think it's within the last year.
Super cool.
Yeah. No More Stranger, or Next Door Strangers is an NPR podcast, I think, that's based out of Salt Lake City. It's a spinoff of Radio West, I think.
Oh, okay. With Lee Benson, maybe?
Yeah.
Lee Hale.
Lee Hale.
It was December 2018.
Something that I'm dying to know, if I could ask one question of the brethren, like, we know that Elder Oaks was the architect of the church's LGBT policy, that when he was called, I don't know if I should say we know, but we understand that as early as the early 1980s, when Elder Oaks was called as an apostle, one of his first assignments was to architect the church's LGBT policy. And from that original document, which I'm sure somebody right now can Google and paste in the link of the Facebook comments of this live stream, he mapped out the need to lobby, the need to work with state legislatures, the need, concerns about the Supreme Court, the needs to work on ballot initiatives. Like, he foresaw all this and architected this big multi-decade strategy that's been lived out in his life from the 80s until now. That's 30, almost 40 years of the arc of kind of his brainchild, we could say. And here we are. And, it's, if all of you are right, then it's got to be true that the brethren are like, in their heart of hearts, oh my goodness, we've really screwed this up, or things are really going south. We need to make a change. Or at least we would all assume that. But I'm just dying to know if in Oaks's or Nelson's heart, they had this moment where they're like, oh my gosh, I think we've really hurt this church. We were stewards to take care of. That feeling of if I had I've had it with Mormon Stories where I've made mistakes as the head of a nonprofit or as the head of a podcast or as a public figure. And I've had that feeling in my heart before, like I was entrusted with something very sacred, very important, and I really goofed relative to the importance of my stewardship. And I'm just dying to know whether they've had that, or if it's more like, oh, well, we got to make a course correction because, but not a sense of sincere concern or morbidity or whatever we could do to describe feelings of them having this personal reckoning that they've taken the church down a course that's truly harmed people and that's truly harmed the church in some ways, possibly irreparably. And that's really not even a question. And of course,
the real dilemma with that is that I think we'd all like to know that. And I think that there's great potential for healing in that knowledge, but none of us can speculate or know anything unless people on the other end are willing to be vulnerable, right? And I talk about intimacy and vulnerability and relationships as being two-way streets. You can't have a one-way relationship. And until they're willing to really kind of practice what we preach in Mormon land, which are these concepts of humility and repentance and love and service, we won't know those things. I think that there's a lot of missed opportunity. Now, granted, in our world, I'm somewhat of a realist. I get that there's liability issues. Anytime you say you're sorry or, all of a sudden you can be slapped with a lawsuit. I mean, that's the kind of world we live in today. So I understand that there's complexities, but at the same time, I kind of expect more from my Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints than a bunch of liability concerns. So if you're going to talk the talk, walk the walk. I'd love to know their heart.
I'm dying to know. Others?
Well, the fact is, they're not perfect. The fact is, they can beat up each other from time, every once in a while. That seniority within the 12, that's a big thing. You honor those above you, and so they make mistakes? Yes. Do they feel it? Yes. That's why they're correcting it right now.
Yeah.
They blew it. And they know they did. I mean, what do you want them to do? Get down on their knees and grovel? They're groveling. They're asking for the sensitivity of the members, and don't be hateful. And hey, you're right. And so sure, we're seeing the evidence of that. Now, am I satisfied? Let me tell you, let me go on the record. I told my children, and I've already told my grandchildren, I've gone public on this. If any of you come to me and say you're gay, that doesn't bother me. Just have fun, be happy, and know that I love you. And that's kind of Anthony and Dan, it is this, when it gets right down to it, it's matters of the heart. And, if my grandchildren know that I love them, that's all they want. They've got to endure enough going to public high school and elementary school and be picked on, but if they know their grandfather loves them, they can make it through. So I think what these guys are doing, they're saying, without saying it, they're saying, we've got to change. And and members, you know, kind of don't be what we were, kind of quick to shoot the arrow. Don't be those things. Just love them. Now, believe me, in the next year, all kinds of questions will come up. You know, eventually it'll be, well, how come we don't have Friday night dances for gays? Oh, you know, well, we can't, and that's the doctrine. You know, 10 years, 15 years down the line, there will be. And so, yeah, they've made mistakes. They're trying to correct it right now. Now, is it these top guys? Yeah, you bet. They're the ones. The buck stops at their desk. And are they receiving revelation? Yeah. You just be the head of a $40 billion empire and then think you've made a mistake. Let me tell you, you're going to get real sensitive real quick.
Love it. Let's talk about the impact, and I've loved everyone's comments so far. Let's talk about the impact on the level of the Orthodox member, the true believer. Has anybody heard from true believers? And I'm asking about this. I reached out to a friend today who's maybe more on the post-Mormon spectrum, and we were trying to decide whether this is going to stop the hemorrhaging. And I think there's some post-Mormons that want the church to hemorrhage. And so they're like, please don't let this stop the hemorrhaging. And then there's others that, you know, maybe would hope that the church could not sink. And so there's this question of, is this going to help? Is this going to stop the hemorrhaging? Or is it going to cause like Denver snuffer, like breakoffs, like you mentioned, Anthony? How are true believing family members reacting to this change? There's one possible reaction, which is what many people say, which is like, look, it's more revelation. Isn't it amazing under Russell M. Nelson, this inspired prophet? We've got all these wonderful revelations. You know, missionaries can call home, 2-hour church. You know, the revelations are just coming. We're being flooded. We can't handle all the revelations. And this just is another, even though it's an overturning of a past policy, to so many members of the church, it's just going to be interpreted as another revelation. And then there's going to be others that are like, oh my gosh, see, the church is great with gay people. All of you who complained about the LGBT stuff, you can't complain anymore. The church is good with gays now, right? That can be another Orthodox reaction. And, you know, but then there could also be the reaction of like people saying, wait a minute, I like with the essay on blacks in the priesthood, there were people who said, oh my gosh, I used to defend that policy. I was a missionary. I wasn't able to teach black people on my mission. Now the church is saying it was just a policy. And the black priesthood essay alone, I think, is responsible for taking more people out of the church than probably any other gospel topics essay. So does anybody have direct firsthand reactions to how true believers are taking this? And which of those possible reactions or others are we seeing? Or do we know yet? Is it too early?
So I mentioned it.
Anthony first, then Roger.
So I mentioned it in my intro that I perceived that some would look at it on a very binary standpoint, and they would say, you know, this was a test of faith, and now you can just come back to church and stuff like that. And then on the post-Mormon side, you know, we have a tendency to want to spike the football and so forth. I agree with you. I think that similar to the race and the priesthood essay, changing people's perception of whether mantles of discernment and spiritual experiences are reliable, this policy change is going to cause additional or lead to additional people to unpack that kind of ambiguity. So I think it's all of the above. I've seen it. I've seen people say the reason that the Lord put in the policy is because the members weren't ready yet. And so now that the members have progressed, now the Lord gave a new revelation, so so we're going to harm all these people because our members aren't ready rather than have them step up to the plate kind of thing. I've seen that. I've seen, yes, many people just say, oh, well, now you can come back to church now. And like I mentioned in the beginning, I really think that for us, the call is to focus on the people that have been harmed by this and to minister to them, to mourn with them, to serve with them, and to offer our hand to bring along the more Orthodox, true-believing Mormons into that ministry to make a difference and serve these people that have been wounded by it. But I've definitely seen some of the things that you've talked about.
I'm dying to know whether, let's just say the hemorrhaging was X. Is now the hemorrhaging going to be X minus Y or X plus Y or X? No change. Anyway, other reactions to that
I think it's exponential because you get more people who are bishops and stake presidency members and high council members and Relief Society presidents unpacking and stepping into nuance and faith transition. I think this is just another thing that contributes to the exponential movement forward in the church to hopefully be a healthier place in the future.
Okay.
Well, we know through the studies of social science and psychology that confirmation bias is a real thing. You hear about these groups where, they'll have a charismatic leader and the second coming is, April 4th of 2019 and they all gather and the second coming doesn't come and the leader then says, oh, it's not April 4th, it's April 23rd. And they all show up on April 23rd, right? So this is groupthink. We all are part of this problem. This is a human tendency in general. And we know that the things that tend to change groupthink or that tend to challenge cognitive dissonance or confirmation bias and, kind of let us lean into cognitive dissonance are the experiences that are emotional, like Dan was talking about at the very beginning and some of you others. So when you have emotional experiences that really speak to your heart, maybe you have a child or a friend or a spouse or something happens, maybe somebody in your ward that you know personally is affected and you see that pain and you experience it with them, that's the beginning of a possible shift. Not even all of those people will necessarily move to a new paradigm. And yet that's a huge ingredient that's needed to move into a new paradigm. So I don't know that the what comes off the pulpit, I mean, we've seen lots of things come off the pulpit that haven't necessarily had huge impacts from one day to the next. As far as, I still think that General Conference will be filled this coming weekend. I don't think that in the believing kind of Orthodox narrative that this will be kind of a blip in the conversation. I'm not even sure they're really going to tune into it much other than, that's interesting. But it is a seed for potential shifts for some of these members as they potentially go through emotional experiences in this realm.
Love it. Thanks, Natasha. Others want to respond to that question? You guys getting worn out? Anyone want to talk about the prospect for same-sex married couples, either those that have been excommunicated or whether or not we can anticipate less excommunications for same-sex marriage in the future? Anyone want to, we just interviewed Dusty Johns about that. Anybody want to comment on that?
So my opinion is that we're going to see more leaders like Dusty's bishop. And I think some of the language, my friend, I mentioned Maxine Hanks earlier, but my friend Maxine mentioned that some of the language here seems to be a softening, even though it calls same-sex marriage a transgression, there seems to be some softening there. And I think that will continue to give some level of permission for more leaders like Dusty's bishop to step forward and do the right thing. That's my sense.
I'm hoping that's true.
I agree with that. And what may be a blip on the radar screen for many of what we were calling, the true believing Mormon, that, whatever they say, that's good with me. Leaders will not have the luxury of that, because now more and more members of their congregation will cause them to at least begin that thinking process and things. So even if it's not on the average member of the church radar as much as we would hope it would be, I think it's going to force the issue for leaders, and they're going to have to really dig deep. So that's a hope.
And that can be really challenging for the church when the well-respected members of the community, former bishops, start losing their faith. And that does happen. Mark, one of our listeners, Mark, writes, most of the TBMs I talked to just acted like, quote, what's the big deal, unquote. They didn't pay attention to the 2015 policy, and they're not paying attention to this. Thank you, Mark, for that comment. I think there are a lot of people that feel that way. Roger Hendricks Jr., so the son of Roger Hendricks, who had to drop off, by the way, he wanted to ask the panel whether this is going to lead to any of you returning to activity in the church. So let's start with you, Sam. Are you going back to church now?
Let's see. I've got another 6 months before I can do anything with regards to the church. No, this wouldn't bring me back to church. And there are some other major concerns that I have. I just think this is a wonderful change they made. I wanted to go back up a little bit with regards to TBM. So I don't have a lot of TBMs that are in my circle right now. But I do have family, and all of my family, of course, are tuned into this because of what I was doing for a few years, and all of them were just delighted by it, thought this is a wonderful change that was made. I really liked something that Dusty said. He said that the changes in the church are going to come as a result of the members. So I think that's probably a big reason that this change happened, was because of the members. But, all these changes are going to happen as far as the gays being more accepted, the gay marriage being accepted, having the very same rights as heterosexual members of the church. That's all going to happen because it's all happening in society. And the kids, as they grow up, all those changes are going to happen in the church. I don't know how long, but I think Roger probably said something made me think, you know what, this is going to happen sooner than later for us. All the changes that you hear speculated about in the ex-Mormon community. That's society. Society is going to cause things to change because our kids, we are in the society that is moving forward in wonderful ways.
Love it. Anyone else want to respond to that?
I would need, I think, for the humility of an apology to be part of the tone, even if it's on a local level. I think that I would need to see an acknowledgement of how messy and unreliable a sense of discernment is, and at least a willingness to accept that for some people, spiritual experiences aren't reliable witnesses of truth, because it appears that they weren't for the brethren in this case. And I would like to see less literalism with regard to interpretation of scriptures, and more actual good critical scholarship with regarding the scriptures. Those are the things that I would like to see. So I think what happens is the TBMs, the true believing active Mormons, more orthodox believing Mormons, they think that the problem with the policy was the trauma and the pain. But for people who have experienced a loss of belief and faith, that's part of it. But it's a recognition that spiritual experiences are not reliable witnesses of truth, and there was no discernment, and the top 15 collectively couldn't even tell the difference between what was inspired and what wasn't. And so it's hard to express that to an Orthodox true believing Mormon when they say, oh, now you can come back, because it's so much more significant and foundational than just the policy.
Yeah. Dan and Natasha, you guys still attend, so we're not going to expect you guys to answer that unless you have something else you want to say to that. Natasha, were you going to say something?
No, I have a different point that I guess I want to make before we completely change it. It kind of had to do more with the previous question you asked about what kind of changes do you think this might have for same-sex marriage? And I mean, there is something fairly significant here just from a cultural perspective, and that is that Oaks did promote this from a sin to a transgression. And Packer did this with masturbation, right? So back in the pamphlet for young men, he promoted it from a horrific, heinous sin that, causes homosexuality and blindness to a transgression.
Do you mean demoted or promoted?
Well, I say promote because it kind of makes it better.
Oh, okay.
However you want to look at it.
Not as bad.
Got it.
However you want to look at that. So I do think that in our Mormon culture, that opens up a lot of interesting doors for people who take, we're people who take language very seriously. And when we talk about Eve transgressed, and we honor Eve, and we see her choice as fairly necessary for the progress of humankind, right? So we have this interesting relationship with the word transgression. And so I do see that as a potential creaking open of a door that might be the way into really some of the more doctrinal shifts that we need to start seeing to make this a tenable situation for our LGBTQ plus people. We'll see, but I do think that some people don't pay attention to those things and still hold to very old and very rigid rhetoric. And yet I think when there is a loophole, the progressives and people like Dusty's bishop take that and run with it. And we may see some potential possibility there.
Love it. I have one final question before we end. Any other topics or items that people want to bring up before I ask kind of a closing question?
Well, I definitely want to talk about just some of the things that people can expect from a mental health perspective, either if you've been affected by this or if you're wanting to support somebody who's been affected by this. So I'd like for those to be my closing thoughts, but I'm open to whatever else you'd like to talk about.
Let's end with that. After I ask a final question, other issues people want to talk about before we get to a closing and a practical recommendation. Any other angles, Anthony, Dan, Natasha, or Sam, you guys wanted to cover? Do you feel tapped out?
Yeah,
I'd say use this as an opportunity to take someone by the hand and take them to Encircle. Use this as an opportunity to support your local LGBTQ resource center. We just have a brand new one that came live in Billings, Montana in the last couple weeks. So use this as a call to do something and bring them along.
Love it. Other final comments? Okay. This is my last question, and it's meant to be in a positive note, and it trails off of what you were saying, Natasha. If, we think about all the changes that have happened in the past year, again, 2-hour church from 3, missionaries can call home weekly, Coke at BYU, right? The undoing of the November 2015 policy. There's probably 10 major changes. The changing of the temple ceremony to be more feminist friendly. What are the big ones that I'm missing, guys? Gals?
Well, I think
Combining
it's pretty comprehensive.
Sam, the churches made changes around allowing parents to be in interviews with children, right?
Yeah.
And trying to make the church a little bit more friendly for children. We've got a long way to go, but that's a change Sam, you and others have directly helped make happen. Any other big changes you guys can think of?
From church-centered to home-centered, but church-supported.
Right? The home-centered study curriculum. Like, huge changes, right? Girls, sister missionaries can wear pants, right? Like
ministering,
the home teaching program, right?
Numbers.
All these changes in like a year, right? So on the one hand, we could see, there's three options sort of. One could be less change, that like the brethren stop at this one and go, okay, we're done. We've made all the accommodations we can. We're done. So the rate of change decreases, right? That's one possibility. I think that's least likely of the three options. So I'm going to say that that's not the most likely outcome. The second possible outcome is a continuation of the rate of change. And that's mind-blowing. But then the other possibility is that there's even more bigger changes than the ones we've seen so far. And that is at least possible. I'm curious, what else is possible? Like, it seems, I posted, and this really angered some, ex-Mormons, post-Mormons. Is this a Mormon Renaissance? Is this a Mormon spring? Like, if these changes have happened so fast, what else could change? And I'm not asking you guys to speculate, although you can, but like, what are your guys' reaction to this idea that maybe we ain't seen nothing yet? And what does that mean for Mormonism? It could mean that 2019 becomes one, I don't want to overstate it because I know the polygamy change was huge and the blacks in the priesthood change was huge, and there have been other changes, but is it over speaking to think that this could be the beginning of a truly significant Mormon Renaissance? Anyone want to take that as a final, before, a penultimate question before we have Natasha give us some practical advice?
In speaking with people who would know, my sense is that there's a lot of change ahead, and it's well thought out and organized and coordinated and not happenstance. And that this change wasn't made, they didn't make this decision last week kind of thing. So I think, we have people like Brian Hoagland and Robin Jensen with the Joseph Smith Papers Project coming out and specifically saying that that Joseph Smith thought he was translating Egyptian from the extant papyri fragments, and he wasn't, and that the lost scroll reconciliation doesn't hold anything. That's huge. I think a lot of people miss that. I think in the future we'll see changes like accepting members who believe that the Book of Mormon is a 19th century creation and not an actual history document. I think that at some point that won't be seen as less than. It might be 10 years, it might be 20. I think eventually we're going to see women exercising priesthood outside of the temple. How that looks, I have no idea. But when you look at, like, there was an interview of President Hinckley asking about women in the priesthood, and his answer was, well, we haven't really asked about it because nobody's really concerned about it, kind of thing. So, but when we look at actual history, women did exercise priesthood. They gave blessings and things like that. So I think we see mothers being able to hold their children when their babies are blessed. I think we see mothers' blessings or parents' blessings. I think that we're going to see a lot of change over time. And I think that's my sense, is either it is going to go back small f fundamentalism, or it's going to be a church where it'll be relevant even after the baby boomers and Gen Xers have passed away. That's my belief.
Beautiful.
Love it.
I think that even doctrine is going to change, or at least the emphasis of it, to me, as we are better able to articulate how truth, and if you want to call it revelation or inspired text or whatever you want to say, operates at multiple levels. And generally the literal level is the least rich. And as soon as we can start to say, the truths that are embedded within stories are more important than whether or not they were factual. As soon as we can get people to do what, like Jody England and I, we recently taught something together, and we just talked about how every single thing in the temple is symbolic. And I think I was able to articulate in Sunday school last year how I felt like the Adam and Eve story was far more powerful as a mythic story rather than a literal one. And it went over fairly well. I'm sure lots of people didn't understand it, but I kind of created that ability through my presence for all those years to say things like that. And so I think doctrine, and I'll tell you the one that I want more than anything else, is externalizing blame to Satan. And that's just a story that clearly, does not work for mature adults. And yet we're staying with that, and everything is Satan is upping his game, and therefore we have to be extra protecting and all that stuff. But I can see that as soon as we who are able to show the fruits of living without those sorts of easy things to blame, and we can look at ourselves and why am I acting against my own good interest? What's going on with me? And that gets back into that shadow work and, the subconscious things that are, so much influencing our lives. I think things like that will happen, but we as a people, and those of us who can, we need to be showing that level is not as scary as people might think it is. So I think we have a lot of work to do, but I really can see doctrine becoming, a more of a fuzzy thing, and more of like, let's hold this because it brings forth fruits. Thomas McConkie, because it's powerful, rather than, we hold it just because a literal reading of scripture says it.
Love it. Love it. Thank you, Dan. And I want to recommend to our listeners Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upward. It does an amazing job of helping us understand that this process the church is going through is so universal. Catholics and Jews and Protestants and everybody's been going through this. And the church has a journey it needs to go through in the context of history. This is a maturation of a religious organization, and individual members since the beginning of time have been going through this process of moving from the literal to the symbolic, of moving from the extrinsic source of authority to the intrinsic source of authority, of moving from scriptures need to be historical to where's the value of the story and of the moral and of the message. And fiction can be more meaningful than the quote truth. And we don't need to see this as anything other than the correct evolution of human history, organizationally and individually. And we all get to be a part of it. So thanks for introducing me to Richard Rohr, Dan Witherspoon.
You bet. And you can go ahead and buy that through a link at Mormon Matters, and I will get a little bit of a
kickback.
Buy from that link through Amazon. I get a little piece of it.
Anybody else want to respond to this last topic, this penultimate topic? Natasha or Sam?
I forgot what the topic was, but I do have something to say.
Please.
So there's been a lot of speculation on changes that might be announced during General Conference. The last conference, the speculation, one of the main ones was changing. It seemed like everybody knew that the length of church was going to be changed from 3 to 2 hours. And so that speculation was out there. But it seemed like at least it caught me by surprise that this was announced. I don't remember a lot of speculation that I don't remember any speculation that this was going to be changed at this conference. I have been disappointed as I've read all the different lists of here are the things we're hearing that might be changed, and protect the children was not on a single list. Well, I'm hoping that it's like this change that nobody was suspecting it was going to happen, that it's somehow didn't get leaked from General Conference, from Salt Lake City. So I've been disappointed, but this kind of thing makes me realize not everything gets leaked out of Salt Lake City. Now, since the changes haven't happened yet, I don't know how many people are viewing this right now, but a bunch of people will continue to view this as it's up, and then if you convert to a podcast. I just want to tell everybody that's listening, is going to be listening, don't allow your children to go behind closed doors all alone. Don't allow anybody to ask them sexual questions. That is going out the door at some place. We are the only church in the world that does this, and it's a horrendous thing. Like Dusty said, the change comes from the members. This is starting to happen where members are not allowing their children to be exposed to this terrible practice. So please, if you're in the church, don't protect your kids. Don't allow this to happen. And there's my final thing, John.
Something tells me, Sam, the only reason you joined us tonight was to be able to end with that plug.
Well, wait a minute. And also climb a mountain and save a child. Get a flag, post it on top of a mountain, a hill, or a driveway. We're going to have a big march coming up October 5th. Be a part of it. We can make a difference. It's time. The children can't march for themselves. The women are marching. The gays are marching. Good for them. That's wonderful. But the children can't. We can march for them and raise this awareness to protect children, not just in the Mormon Church, but in every church. Okay, that's right. That's why I accepted your invitation, John.
Sam, the message isn't as impactful when it's not from a hot tub. I'm just going to tell you that right now.
Well, I consider doing that, frankly.
Well, I'm a huge backer of Sam's message, and I would agree with that. I would also just make a few comments about change that you asked about, John. I think change is an inevitable aspect of living. We know that. We're constantly in a flux of change. We also know that we resist it, and that's very natural. And so that's a constant tension and, a force that's within all of us. I am continually very grateful and very, find it very part of my sacred kind of relationship with Mormonism that we have within our narrative, our story, the ability to have change be part of a church community. We call that ongoing revelation, whatever we want to call it. I think it's a very wonderful reality that we don't have all the information, that we need to seek continual information, and that we can continually do better. And so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we can do that. I think we have the tools in place to be able to do that. I think Mormonism creates amazing, beautiful, creative, talented people for whatever reason. As broken as we might be, we are an amazing people, and I have great faith in us to be able to persevere.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you, Natasha. Shout out to Leah Young and Cody Young. I just saw Leah's joined us. We just found out this week that Leah and Cody Young have been summoned to a disciplinary council for nothing more than starting a support group in Cleveland, Ohio for questioning and post-Mormons. So sending out love to them. Glad they could join us just for a bit. Thank you for everyone so far who's commented. All right, any final things before we let Natasha give us the practical advice for those who are in need? Anthony, did you get to say everything you want to say?
I would, just with regard to the Youngs, I would mention the leadership roulette part of it, because I've met with members of both local stake presidencies about our Mormon Spectrum support group. And in the last stake conference, in the stake that I'm in, one of the members of our group was one of the primary speakers speaking about faith crisis and referred to our support group. So I just wish that the Youngs leaders understood that it doesn't have to be an adversarial thing, that support groups can make a huge difference and help people remain active in the church if that's what spiritually feeds them. So I was just thinking about the Youngs.
Amen.
Mine is slightly practical too. I just want to plug spiritual practice, everybody. Some sort of daily attempt to sit in your deepest self, to sit in your spirit and to be open without you trying to direct it, or without you in your mind taking you away from it. So whether that's sitting meditation, maybe whether that's walking, whether it's mindfulness, something that keeps you present and connected to something larger. If we want spiritual experience, it's important, you know, not that it doesn't happen sometimes out of the blue completely, but the more we put ourselves on the train tracks, we're more likely to get hit by the train, and we're more likely to have those energies flow to us. So I just want to always plug in that, you know, even though like, well, I've tried praying, I've tried attending church, I've tried, you know, doubling down on this and all that stuff, you know, it's never a wrong move to double down on your prayer life, your scripture reading, but just know that you can have different lenses, and you as a more mature being are going to have a prayer life and an approach to scripture that is much broader than when it was all petitionary and whatnot. So I'm just going to say, keep always working on your own centering, and it's so much easier to be in a mode where we're acting versus just purely reacting. So that's what I'll end with. So thanks for having me on, Sean.
All right. Check out Dan's new podcast called
Latter-day Faith. Go to latterdayfaith.org and you can listen to the first one even before you can get it on iTunes.
All right. Okay, Natasha, tell us what we can do to support our LGBTQ loved ones and anyone else who is in distress or needing help.
Awesome. And feel free to help me out because you've got a lot of great perspectives on this as well. So I think the first thing I want to just really talk about is the normal response to something like today. I got a text from a dear friend. She's a mama dragon, and she, you know, has several lesbian daughters. And she said, "I'm so fuming mad, right? I was super excited this morning. Now I'm angry as hell. What just happened to me? Whiplash." I think that's a really great example of just kind of the roller coaster ride of what today might feel like to a lot of people who've been affected by this personally. And so for those of us who maybe haven't been affected as personally, to be aware of that, and that to not just assume that people should be celebrating or should feel happy about this. Anytime we're shoulding, we're probably not doing a great thing to begin with. I have a blog on the Mormon Therapist blog by Blair Osler, who did a really great job. She's a queer Latter-day Saint woman, talking about this reaction that's very normal. I would also say that feeling gaslighted is normal, which means, you know, that means like, am I a little crazy? Because I'm feeling like they're telling me I should feel loved and happy about this, and yet I feel really distressed and upset and hurt. Okay, that's normal because that's what's happening. So gaslighting is happening here. So I just want to normalize that. And then, so, you know, whether you're listening to this as somebody who's been affected or somebody who wants to be an ally, remember that supportive communities are hugely important. So make sure you're reaching out to people who will empathize with you, who will agree with you, who will nod their heads at you, not people who, even though they may love you, will give a kind of a dismissive or condescending approach to this. So find people that get it, whether that's in a support group forum, an online forum, in person, whatever you can find. And let's try to be those people for people who are struggling. Be clear and firm with some boundaries. So know what you can take. You don't have to stay in a conversation. Get off the comments threads of most of these news articles because they're horrific. And sometimes even in my LDS, like the Mormon Therapist blog, I cannot believe what some members say about other members on those things. It's just really horrific how we treat each other online. So have good self-care boundaries about what you will or will not engage in, including conversations. If it's getting too heated, take a time out, go splash water on your face, go take a walk, excuse yourself from conversations that are triggering and making things worse. All kinds of self-care. What do you need to do? Sometimes self-care is a distraction. Go watch a funny show, call a friend, you know, go on a walk. Sometimes it's a mindfulness type approach. You sit with yourself, you do spiritual practice, whatever type of approach you need, and get professional help if and when needed. Sometimes things like this can trigger thoughts of dying. I don't want anybody to die over this. A lot of times we talk about death and suicide in ways that are not super helpful. I just went to a suicide workshop that was quite distressing to me because we're not doing a great job in the mental health community even of really finding effective ways to help people in this regard. And what they talk a lot is that we oftentimes say things very clinically. We talk about suicidal ideation. We talk about, support groups, and all of that is important. But the reality is, I don't want anyone to die tonight because of this news that we just got. There's no need for that. I understand that at some level that's a personal decision, but we as a community want to support anybody who is feeling that way. So please know that there are resources and people who are willing to talk to you. Sometimes that can start with a 24-hour hotline. There are other possibilities as well, including, of course, at the very extreme, an emergency room visit. At the same time, that can feel very distressing to people. So find community that can help you, that can sit with you, that can come over and spend the night with you. Whatever it is that you need, ask for it. So many of us want to help in that way. So those are my closing thoughts.
Love it. Thanks to an amazing panel. Thanks to all our commenters. We've had amazing comments tonight that we weren't able to get to. Thanks to everyone who supports the Open Stories Foundation and Mormon Stories podcast. Literally, your donations make all this possible. If you don't donate, and if you value this programming, please donate. MormonStories.org, $10 a month, $50 a month, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. It goes towards this office. It goes towards the technology. It goes towards editing. It goes towards insurance. It goes towards staff. We need your support. So please support us. Please support Latter-day Faith podcast, Mormon Matters podcast, or no, not Mormon Matters podcast, Latter-day Faith podcast, Mormon Mental Health podcast. Protect the children, protect all children, protect LDS children. What are you going to plug, Anthony? Sunstone?
Sunstone, definitely Sunstone, and local Mormon Spectrum in-person support communities. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. Yeah, please if you value this stuff, please donate, become monthly donors, and this stuff won't go away. We love this work. We feel like it's important, and we need your support. Thanks to everyone who listens. Please share this episode with everyone that you can. Please like us on Facebook. Please give us a positive review on Facebook to counterbalance the haters that give us bad reviews without even listening to what we do. Please give us positive reviews on iTunes. And just please stay in the conversation. Make positive contributions wherever you can with your families, with your ward, with leaders. Just let's keep trying to be positive and do good things. I think we should all celebrate the positive change of the past 14, 15 years. And I think there's a lot more positive change we can help influence if we stay engaged. So stay engaged, everybody. Love to you, panel. Please come back and join us again soon. And to all our listeners, we love you guys.
Thank you, John.
See you guys again soon.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye, everybody.
Good night to all. I really enjoyed this.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Beautiful panel. See y'all soon.